A single company once had its own army, its own navy, and ruled over 200 million people. Not a government, not a kingdom, a company. A business with shareholders, a board of directors, and quarterly profit targets. This isn't science fiction. This is one of the most insane chapters in human history. And most people have no idea how it actually happened, or how much of the modern world it shaped. Let me take you back to the year 1600, my friend. England was a second-rate European power. Spain and Portugal were dominating global trade. The Ottoman Empire controlled the overland routes to Asia. English merchants were desperate, hungry, and willing to gamble everything on a wild idea, sail halfway around the world, through waters they barely knew, to buy pepper and spices directly from the source. So on December 31st, 1600, literally the last day of the century, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to a group of London merchants. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Catchy name, right? We know them as the East India Company, or the EIC, and that single piece of paper signed on New Year's Eve set in motion a chain of events that would reshape continents. Here's the thing most people miss, buddy. This wasn't a government project. This was a private business. A joint stock company where wealthy investors pooled their money, hoping for massive returns. From day one, the EIC existed for one purpose and one purpose only: profit. Everything else, every treaty signed, every battle fought, every territory seized, was just a means to that end. Keep that in mind, because it explains everything that follows. The early years were rough. The Dutch already dominated the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, and they weren't interested in sharing. After a brutal massacre of English traders at Amboina in 1623, where Dutch authorities tortured and executed 10 EIC employees on trumped-up conspiracy charges, the company was essentially kicked out of Southeast Asia. So, they pivoted. They turned their attention to India. And that pivot, born out of failure and humiliation, changed the course of world history. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. India in the 1600s wasn't some backward region waiting to be civilized. Far from it. The Mughal Empire was one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. India produced roughly 25% of the world's GDP. Let that number sink in for a moment. A quarter of everything produced on the planet came from India. Their textile industry was the envy of the world. Indian cotton, silk, and muslin were so superior in quality and craftsmanship that European manufacturers literally couldn't compete. When Indian cloth showed up in European markets, local producers panicked. This was a civilization that had nothing to learn from England about commerce or culture. The EIC started small. Trading posts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They bought Indian textiles and sold them in Europe for enormous profits. But here's the dark genius of what happened next. The company realized that trade alone wasn't enough. To maximize profits, they needed control. The Mughal Empire began fragmenting in the early 1700s after the death of Emperor Aurangzeb. Regional rulers started fighting each other. Successor states squabbled over territory and tax revenue. And the EIC saw opportunity in chaos, the way a predator sees opportunity in a wounded animal. They started hiring local soldiers, called sepoys, and training them with European military tactics and weapons. They played rulers against each other, backing one side in a conflict and then collecting the reward when their side won. Step by step, the company built a private army that would eventually become larger than the British state's own military forces. The turning point came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a company clerk turned military commander, a man who had arrived in India as a teenager with no military training whatsoever, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of bribery, betrayal, and brute force. The battle itself was almost farcical. The Nawab's own general, Mir Jafar, was paid off to betray his ruler and hold his troops back. The so-called battle lasted barely a few hours, but its consequences would last centuries. After Plassey, the EIC essentially took control of Bengal, the richest province in India, a region with more people and more wealth than all of England. And this is where the exploitation machine kicked into high gear, my friend. The EIC imposed devastating tax collection systems. Bengal's artisans and farmers, who had been relatively prosperous, were now squeezed dry. The company forced weavers to sell their products at artificially low prices while taxing peasants into destitution. Within just 10 years of Plassey, Bengal experienced one of the worst famines in human history. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's entire population. 1 in 3 people gone. While millions starved, the EIC actually increased tax collection. Let that sink in. People were dying in the streets, and the company's response was to squeeze harder. Company officials in London barely flinched. Profits continued to flow. Shareholders received their dividends. The machinery of extraction hummed along as bodies piled up in villages across the delta. But here's what really gets me. The EIC didn't just exploit India through brute extraction. They systematically destroyed India's manufacturing base. Remember those incredible Indian textiles I mentioned? British manufacturers lobbied Parliament to impose massive tariffs on Indian cloth imports to Britain. At the same time, the EIC flooded India with cheap British manufactured goods. Indian weavers, some of the most skilled artisans in the world, people whose families had perfected their craft over centuries, were driven into poverty. Some historical accounts describe weavers cutting off their own thumbs in despair because they could no longer practice their craft. An entire tradition of excellence, erased in a generation. This wasn't accidental, buddy. This was deliberate deindustrialization on a scale the world had never seen before. India went from producing 25% of global GDP to less than 2% by the time the British left in 1947. Read that again. From a quarter of the world's economy to a rounding error. That's not a natural decline. That's not the invisible hand of the market doing its thing. That's economic warfare carried out systematically over generations, backed by the full force of state power serving corporate interests. The EIC also pioneered something we'd recognize instantly today: the revolving door between business and government. Company officials became members of Parliament. They bought seats in the House of Commons the way you'd buy shares in a stock. They used political influence to protect their monopoly, crush competitors, and expand their territory. At its peak, the EIC controlled virtually all of South Asia with a private army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at the time. Think about that for a second. A corporation with 250,000 soldiers under arms, answering not to a king or a parliament, but to a board of directors obsessed with the next quarter's returns. The company also got into the drug trade, because apparently conquering a subcontinent wasn't profitable enough. When they couldn't find enough goods to trade with China for tea, they started growing opium in India and selling it illegally in China. They turned Indian farmers into opium producers and Chinese citizens into addicts, all to balance a trade deficit. This led directly to the Opium Wars. But that's a whole other story we've already covered. By the mid-1800s, the EIC had become too powerful and too corrupt even for the British government to tolerate. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown finally dissolved the company and took direct control of India. The rebellion itself was a bloody, traumatic affair on both sides, and the British reprisals were savage. But even after the company was gone, the damage was done. The systems of extraction, the racial hierarchies, the economic structures that treated an entire subcontinent as a resource to be mined, they all continued under direct British rule. The company died, but its logic lived on. So what's the real lesson here, my friend? The East India Company shows us something profoundly uncomfortable about how the modern world was built. A private corporation, driven by nothing more than the profit motive, managed to conquer, exploit, and reshape an entire civilization. Shareholders in London coffee houses made investment decisions that determined whether millions of people across the ocean would eat or starve, live or die. They never saw the faces of the people they ruined. They didn't need to. The balance sheets told them everything they wanted to know. The EIC invented many of the tools that powerful corporations still use today: lobbying governments, creating monopolies, externalizing costs onto vulnerable populations, using military force to protect business interests, and wrapping all of it in the language of progress and civilization. The scale was different, sure, but the logic is disturbingly familiar. Next time someone tells you that corporations should be free from government regulation, remind them about the East India Company. Remind them what happens when profit has no limits, no oversight, and no accountability. Because history, buddy, history has already run that experiment, and the results weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. For 200 years, they were catastrophic.